Hello and a very warm welcome to the AIBs 2021. I'm in Hastings. It's on the south coast of England, about 55 miles south of London and 14 miles from the AIBs headquarters. Now, Hastings has a great deal of history. There was a small battle here back in 1066. William the Conqueror built the castle whose remains still dominate the town today. In medieval times, it became one of the Cinque Ports. And that maritime history continues today because it's home to the largest beach-launched fishing fleet in Europe. And for those of us in broadcasting, Hastings played one of the most significant, yet perhaps understated, roles in the development of mass media. A man called John Logie Baird lived in this house, and it was here that he developed something very important to us all: television. He constructed the world's first television receiver here, and he used things like scissors, a hat box, bicycle lamps, and some sealing wax. He then moved to a workshop in Queen's Arcade, about a quarter of a mile from here, and it was there that he gave the world's first public demonstration of television. That was back in 1924, when experiments with novel technology were quite fraught with danger. Later that year, Baird was thrown across that workshop with a 1,200 volt electric shock. His landlord evicted him soon after, and he moved to Soho in London's West End to continue his development work. And remarkably, in the 1940s, that included 1,000 line high-definition television and 3D TV. We've got much to thank John Logie Baird for. Now, there's also another reason for me to be here in Hastings today, and that's going to become clear at the end of this first part of the AIBs 2021. And so, back to the awards. For the second year running, we are holding our awards as an online production, rather than our traditional live evening of celebration. I really hope that next year our 18th awards will be celebrated in person. We want once again to be able to welcome people from around the world to share inspiration, share ideas, share knowledge, share experience, and to be part of this truly international festival of journalism and factual productions. In the meantime, we're not going to be outwitted by the pandemic. Instead, for the second year, we're mounting what I hope you'll agree is a fitting tribute to all the journalists, the editors, the producers, the presenters, in fact, the whole teams whose work for television, radio and digital platforms has been submitted to the AIBs. So, sit back, perhaps pour yourself a glass of something refreshing and enjoy the ride. But now, let me hand over to Kamahl Santamaria of Al Jazeera English. He's in Studio 14 in Doha, and he's going to be hosting us for the rest of today. Kamahl.
Simon, thank you so much for that introduction, and a fascinating bit of history as well. Very glad Baird survived that 1,200 volt electric shock. Otherwise, well, none of us might have a job today. Let me add my own welcome to the AIBs 2021, and as Simon said, to Studio 14 here at Al Jazeera in Doha. This is where programs like Counting the Cost and Inside Story come from, as well as a whole variety of programs on our Arabic language service. The AIBs are a highlight of the year for many working in journalism, be it TV, radio or digital. They are globally renowned, and I'm thrilled to be hosting them this year. Journalism and factual storytelling remains as important as ever. Audiences deserve to know what's going on in the world around them, and broadcast journalism is vital to connect us all and help us understand events with immediacy and clarity. The AIBs showcase the world's best. As Simon mentioned, the program is packed, and that is because we want to do justice to everyone whose work has been shortlisted in the AIBs 2021. Work in 23 languages, produced by 83 companies from 35 countries, all entered in the competition, statistics which do demonstrate the significance of the AIBs. And from those hundreds of hours of content, a shortlist was produced. So given the immense strength of all the work originally entered, our big congratulations go to everyone whose productions and journalism made it through to the final. Now, judging all of the shortlisted entries has been the work of our international panel of judges, 50 experts who gave up their time over the past few weeks to evaluate and deliberate. Now, the AIB Secretariat did make sure none of the judges met their own work or that of colleagues from the same organisation, so the judging is fair and transparent, and we thank everyone on this international jury for contributing to the success of the AIBs 2021. Now, in today's programme, we will present results in the first 11 categories. And at the end of this edition, we will have the traditional In Conversation, when a remarkable photojournalist and humanitarian campaigner will be speaking to Simon back in Hastings. In part 2, that'll be released on Monday the 15th of November, the remaining 10 winners will be announced. And you can follow along in the programme the AIBs booklet, which you can download at theaibs.tv. Right, let's get going. And demonstrating that this really is an international event, let me introduce Andrea Giordani in Malta, who will give some context to all the categories.
Thanks, Kamahl. The pandemic has had myriad impacts across the world. One industry severely affected is fashion. As global retail shut, orders for clothing went to zero, and garment workers in countries like Bangladesh were laid off for months. COVID-19, fashion's great unravelling.
A former child garment worker turned activist, Kalpana Akhtar once helped fuel the overseas supply chain. Since the pandemic hit, she's been on the front line helping many navigate the fallout.
This is one of the biggest garment districts, and if you see this factory up there, the hundreds of workers are waiting, all of them who lost job during this pandemic, and they're just waiting here if there is a new hire happen. This is like disaster happening in here.
Young tech entrepreneurs are building the future of Africa. They're imagining new ways to deliver services and solve people's problems. Startup Africa.
The problem that Yugabus is addressing is the inconvenience that passengers have to go through in being able to book bus tickets. The whole challenge of you having to ask yourself how much do they charge. And I'm like, okay, just check it out on your phone. So all that entire problem that people face in using buses is what Yugabus is addressing through our digital products. So Yugabus will display a screen where you're supposed to put in where you're coming from and where you are going.
What was life really like in America in the run-up to last year's election? Two Welsh expatriates travelled the country and discovered more than they expected. Trump America, anew.
Do'n i'm disgwyl cyfarfod Americanwr du sy'n fan o Trump ar y maes tanio yma.
I feel like the Black Lives Matter organization is more leaning towards like a terrorist organization. I feel like all of the riots and all that was not necessary at all. People just keep canceling each other out and not having discussions, and that's also part of the problem. A part of it is a lot of people assume, so like, oh, if you support Trump, you're racist. Like, right. I'm not racist, I support Trump. Right.
For years, Xia Shi has been a lonely dissenting voice inside the Chinese Communist Party. Expelled in 2020, she's now in exile in the States, where she gave her first interview.
问题啊，实际上它不是人的问题，这个问题就要讲到是这个党内的体制问题。毛泽东也是没人能制约他，因为党内没有制度。后来邓小平讲，因此要强调党的制度建设。但是呢，实际上你的制度啊，它有个根本的东西就是权力结构。当权力是高度集权的时候，你只改那种技术性的局部的操作的那种制度没有用。你不把整个权力真正按照民主的方向去分权制衡，你是没有办法解决它的。
Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom, yet there's now a customs border between the province and the rest of the UK that's causing disruption to food distribution and online commerce. Brexit, the Irish Sea border.
So that piece of Stilton, how much would that cost to bring in wholesale?
It's roughly around about £60.
So if a situation was to arise where you're being told you need a piece of administration or certification to bring that in, and that's costing 40, 50, 60, maybe more for that one cheese, what does that mean for bringing in Stilton?
It's going to probably double the price of it. I would say there obviously be a bit of a pretty much of a decline in demand, so there would be. You can take a £10 charge or something like that, because people will accept 5 to 10, 15, even 20%, but not when they're talking 100% increase. I mean, that's just ridiculous.
So already, in just our first category, we have travelled to all 5 continents. Told you, the AIBs are amazingly inclusive. Now, as well as the overall winner in each category, the judges asked for commendations to be given. And in this first category, for its breadth and ambition, a commendation goes to Trump America Anew, that was produced by Celebro and the Hee Haw production for S4C, the national Welsh language broadcaster in Wales. The winner, though, for what the judges noted was a thought-provoking and compelling investigation into a globally important story, is SBS Australia and COVID-19 fashion's great unravelling. Now, Caliste Weintenberg is the reporter and producer. And Caliste, how is the restriction on travel between Australia and the rest of the world affecting the fashion industry?
I think it's having an enormous effect on the recovery of the industry, and one that's really quite profound. It's really struck at the very heart of the offshore manufacturing model that exists here in Australia, where 95% of retailers make their clothes overseas. The flow-on effect of international shipping delays has seen an enormous build-up of excess stock here in Australia. These are clothes that were made quickly and cheaply and intended to be sold that way, but ultimately arrived in the country too late when consumers effectively weren't buying anymore. I think at the height of the pandemic, we saw only 30% of retailers here were confident that they'd ever fully recover. So I think that fact alone is forcing a real profound soul searching, around questions of the supply chain and the question of, why does the model look the way it does? And is it sustainable?
And Caliste, people's attitudes towards throwaway fashion, have they changed at all since this pandemic?
I think people's attitudes to throwaway fashion have significantly shifted since the pandemic, by and large because we were in lockdown for such long periods of time. I mean, these were periods in which we couldn't see friends and family, we weren't attending events or going out, and effectively had no reason to buy new clothes. I think the pandemic has been a really significant and really important pause on what was essentially, mindless consumerism. I think younger generations in particular are really doing some soul searching around, the rate at which they were buying clothes, the amount of clothes they were buying, and, the prices they were paying, and whether or not that was sustainable. And many are looking to alternate options now. I think there's been an enormous boom in, recycled clothing and, vintage clothing thanks to online apps and things like this. So I'm really excited by that, and I hope that, it continues into the future.
As the sun set on August the 4th, 2020, Beirut was shaken to its core by the explosion of ammonium nitrate stored at the city's port. Al Jazeera English reported from the Lebanese capital.
Search and rescue teams are still digging through the rubble at Beirut port, the site of massive explosions that damaged or destroyed much of the Lebanese capital. Families are desperate for news about their loved ones. Dozens are missing. There is pain and grief. Zainab Meshek fears she will never see her husband Ali again.
I don't know where he is. I haven't heard from him since 6 p.m. Monday. I want to know if he's alive or dead.
Rescue experts from abroad have started to arrive to help a country that wasn't prepared to cope with a disaster like this.
In November 2020, conflict erupted in Ethiopia's northern Tigray province. Troops were sent in to bring down the Tigray People's Liberation Front. Al Jazeera English reported on the impacts of the war.
The camp has only one health center to cater for the thousands of children here. Mothers wait for their turn to have their children seen by doctors. Many children exposed to the horrors of conflict in the first years of their lives.
According to UNICEF, 40% of the refugees arriving in Sudan are children. Some have been separated from their families, and the process of tracking them has started. Others have arrived with malnutrition because of the days they spent walking with no food. And all have been affected by the conflict in Tigray in a way that will likely impact their childhood.
The UN's Children's Agency says that restricted access and the ongoing communication blackout in the Tigray region have left an estimated 2.3 million children in need of humanitarian assistance.
9 cyclones hit the Philippines in the last 3 months of 2020, including one of the strongest tropical cyclones ever recorded. GMA Network reported on the calamity in a country already suffering severely from the pandemic.
Ganito ang sitwasyon sa malaking bahagi ng poblasyon dito sa bayan ng Nabwa. At kung tutuusin, mga veterano na raw sila sa pagsagupa sa baha. Pero hindi nila inasahan ang ganito kataas na tubig mula sa Super Typhoon Rolly. Ang mga residente, kanya-kanyang diskarte sa pamumuhay sa kabila ng baha. Ang iba, may mga hagdan na diretso sa second floor ng kanilang mga bahay. Ang babaeng ito, animoy naglalabas sa batis. Pero ang dumadaloy na tubig, galing sa umaapaw na creek.
Malungkot lang po, wala kaming lahat na basa yung gamit namin. Kasi biglang hangin, malakas. Isa pa po, yung mama nitong aso namatay.
The result of a US election has an impact far beyond the shores of America. CNA brought its audience across Asia analysis and context of November's election.
You've talked to many people in Vietnam, and the majority have showed support for President Trump for another term in office. Why would that be so?
The main reason is Mr. Trump's anti-China policies. In Vietnam, there's many people I talk to believe that under Mr. Trump have substantive actions to counter China, and many believe that Vietnam has been a victim of China's coercion and increasingly aggressive actions in the South China Sea.
Reporting the pandemic has been challenging for all news organisations and journalists, particularly Good Morning Britain's Kate Garraway. Her husband is Britain's longest fighting COVID-19 patient, hospitalised for 15 months.
Kate's husband is still desperately ill. We've seen many young people on this programme this week talking about how they contracted the virus, they think, in Tenerife, they brought it back here. And we've got a large number of people that we know from studies are not self-isolating when they should be. And that's irresponsible.
It does make me tempted to show a picture of Derek in his current state and say, you don't want this in your life. You just don't want this in your life, and you don't know who it'll affect and how. So, you know, stick to it. Stick to the best. I think there's huge confusion around it, and we've also been told different messages at different times. But I think we kind of know that wearing a mask, not mixing with people, social distancing, we know the basics, don't we? And we have to just do our best.
Kate Garraway there, rounding out that segment. Her husband, Derek Draper, continues his life-changing struggle with COVID. And of course, we send Derek, Kate and all their family our best wishes. Now, our judges were impressed with all the entries and, in particular, Al Jazeera English for its coverage of the Tigray conflict. Also GMA Network, who covered the immensely powerful cyclones in the Philippines. The winner in this category, though, for determination, resilience and supreme professionalism in their reporting, remaining thorough and objective without losing empathy, Al Jazeera English for Beirut Blast. And Zaina Khoda is based in Beirut for Al Jazeera. Zaina, congratulations. We all remember this one well. A fast-moving story that affected everyone. Tell us about the challenges you faced in making this for an international audience.
This was a massive explosion, nothing like I experienced or witnessed in the past. And I've been close to blasts before reporting from war zones. There was so much confusion at the beginning. Nobody knew what was happening. But once information started to trickle in and people started to find out really what exactly happened, an explosion at Beirut port, our responsibility was not just to report about the casualties, the human suffering, the destruction, but what exactly happened. And when it became clear that this was the result of ammonium nitrate, tons and tons of ammonium nitrate stored in a warehouse with highly flammable material, we also had to explain to an international audience, how can something like this happen? But, you know, for many this is not surprising because Lebanon state institutions, corruption, negligence, mismanagement is endemic in state institutions, and the port really included.
And for you, being based in Beirut, Zaina, this must have been incredibly personal. How does, in fact, the August 2020 blast continue to affect you?
This was personal. We survived. Myself, my family. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't think about that explosion that day. I can still hear that explosion. My 3-year-old son, we were outdoors walking in the street. The pressure wave pushed him to the ground. Up to today, he doesn't walk down that street. And I can tell you many, many other people in this country are traumatized. And we were not really on the front line. We were like 3 or 4 kilometers away from that explosion. You know, there is a responsibility to keep telling this story, to follow the investigations, because the truth, what exactly happened, there needs to be accountability and justice for so many people to have closure.
More than 1 million people are incarcerated in detention camps in Xinjiang province. Camp employees and guards have been complicit in the rape and torture of detainees, as a chilling report by BBC World News revealed.
And she's haunted by one image: masked men coming down a camp corridor like this one after midnight.
They were 3 men. Not 1, but 3. They did whatever evil their mind could think of, and they didn't spare any part of my body, biting it to the extent that it was disgusting to look at.
Many of the world's biggest coastal cities are likely to be most heavily impacted by the climate emergency. AFP spoke to some of those most threatened by the changes the planet is experiencing, and the scientists who are sounding the alarm.
As the earth warms and the ice melts, the seas, once a source of wealth, will redraw the map of the world, forcing millions from their homes. Eventually, scientists predict entire cities will have to be abandoned to the flood.
We're all mortal. We live our lives knowing we're going to die. But I don't think we often think of our cities in those terms. And most of our coastal cities are mortal. A lot of them will end by flood in the long run. And by 2050, that may be much more widely appreciated.
In Kenya's Rift Valley, 2 adjoining lakes have increased massively in size and are on the brink of meeting. It's a result of deforestation along the rivers that feed them. Al Jazeera English reports, if they come together, wildlife and livelihoods will be threatened.
This is one of the rivers that feed Lake Bogoria, and our game warden says the big problem is right here, because if the water from the lake, which is rising, gets to this point, then it could reverse the course of the river, mix up with swamps downstream, which connect with Baringo freshwater lake. The effects to the ecosystem will be disastrous. Lake Baringo, 13 kilometers to the north, has fresh water. The 2 lakes were 20 kilometers apart not too long ago. Lake Baringo is rising at about 2.5 centimeters a day. Its water has increased by up to 12 meters in the last 7 years.
In his attempts to beat Joe Biden in the US election, President Trump sought to leverage Ukraine's war with Russian separatists for his own gain. CNN uncovered the depth of the Trump campaign's attempts to smear Biden.
It was the call that set events in motion.
Okay, so we should have on the line here America's mayor, Mayor Giuliani, and we have Andrei Yermak.
Thrusting a reluctant Ukraine into America's divided politics. We already know through transcripts and testimony, Giuliani pressured them to announce investigations important to then President Trump. But this is the first time we've heard his actual voice.
I want very much to see that our 2 countries are able to work together.
How Giuliani cajoled the Ukrainian presidential advisor on the other end of the line.
The storming of the US Capitol, perhaps the greatest symbol of US democracy,
USA! USA!
was one of the world's biggest news stories in January 2021. ITV News reported from amongst the mob as the attack unfolded.
What's the purpose of storming Congress itself?
Because they work for us. They don't get to steal it from us. They don't get to tell us we didn't see what we saw.
We respect the law. We were good people. The government did this to us. We were normal, good, law-abiding citizens, and you guys did this to us. We want our country back. We are protesting for our freedom right now. That's the difference.
What's the purpose of storming Congress? How do I know that?
Iraq's Mandaeans practice a distinct and ancient religion that predates Islam and Christianity. This religious minority group is under threat of extinction, as Al Jazeera English reported.
One can only be born into the faith, and marrying into their religion is forbidden. And the population has dwindled even further because thousands have taken refuge elsewhere for safety. Seema and her sister left Iraq because of airstrikes and war. Today they say they're happy to have returned home.
When we left for Jordan, we thought we will never come back. We thought we will never participate in our religious ceremonies again. I'm happy to see our relatives and everyone participating in our festival.
Once again, an extraordinary range of stories covered by teams all over the world. We have a commendation for a thorough, exhaustive investigation. That is rape and sexual abuse in Uyghur detention camps from BBC World News. The winner in this category for bold and courageous reporting and clear-headed eyewitness news reporting is News at 10, the storming of the Capitol from ITV News. And correspondent Robert Moore joins us from Washington, D.C. Now, Robert, this was a dramatic, frankly unbelievable event. What were the most challenging moments inside the Capitol?
Well, the key to reporting on January the 6th was to be at the very front of the crowd. And yes, there were perilous moments. There was obviously hand-to-hand fighting between those in the mob and law enforcement. But what we also noticed was that once we were in Congress itself, then the crowd was fixated on trying to overturn the election result, and somehow we could sort of improvise and be just fly-on-the-wall reporters. But certainly another challenge was actually getting out of the building and then to make sure that we delivered our report in time for News at 10, our flagship program that night. So there were challenges getting in, there were challenges getting out, and there was above all else a virulently anti-media atmosphere that day.
And here we are now, Robert, coming up for a year on. How do you think even that American society will be able to recover from the fractions that the Capitol incident so vividly demonstrated?
Well, it was a seismic event in political terms, nothing less than a would-be insurrection trying to overturn a democratic presidential American election. So the stakes were vast, but it's important to remember that the schism in America predates January the 6th. It predates, of course, Donald Trump himself, and it didn't end on January the 6th. The big ruptures in American politics, the bitter partisanship, the fights over politics, over abortion, over guns, over this country's culture wars, they will go on, and therefore the 2024 election could also be deeply toxic. I think January the 6th is best seen not as the end of the story, but potentially as just the beginning, as a sort of foreshadowing of conflict that could yet rupture this country.
On 23rd of March 2020, New Zealand PM Jacinda Ardern announced that the country would enter lockdown 48 hours later. Radio New Zealand cleared its schedule to cover this, the biggest story in the life of almost every New Zealander.
Sorry.
Are you okay?
Massive headache and too much coughing.
How often does that happen? Is that a continuous hacking like that?
I'm calling it the COVID-19 for over 40s because I peed myself from coughing.
Kiwi Janine Crossan has lost track of the days at North Shore Hospital. She has coronavirus.
The only reason I've shared all of this has been to just ensure that everyone takes it seriously.
We currently have 102 cases.
She is case number 37.
The situation here is moving at pace, and so must we.
The explosion in the port of Beirut in August 2020 resulted in the deaths of over 200 people and left many thousands injured. In its Sky News daily sequence, the broadcaster followed up the event of the previous evening.
Anything within the immediate blast zone has been pretty much flattened, and then it stretches out for miles in terms of the impact, and the fact that the sound could be heard as far away as Cyprus just gives you a sense of the enormity of what happened. And actually an expert that I spoke to, a bomb disposal and explosives expert, said that in his 30-year career, including time spent in the military, he had never witnessed or seen an explosion of that magnitude other than sort of nuclear devices being tested.
My goodness me.
The attack on the US Capitol by a violent mob was covered by Bloomberg Radio, who reported from inside the building and interviewed lawmakers caught up in the incident.
We had an election that was stolen from us. It was a landslide election, and everyone knows it, especially the other side. But you have to go home now. We have to have peace.
Twitter later locked the president's account for 12 hours, and Facebook blocked him from posting for 24 hours.
Reaction is pouring in to the invasion of the Capitol, and here is House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy.
This is my saddest day as a member of Congress. And what we have to do is take this moment to take this divide in this nation and understand we could have differences of opinion.
3 examples there of radio journalism demonstrating its power and its flexibility. Judges ask for a commendation for exemplary coverage and powerful actuality. That goes to attack on the US Capitol by Bloomberg Radio. The winner of the Radio and Audio News Reporting Award, though, for high news value and a remarkable ability to convey a challenging atmosphere is COVID Lockdown Special from Radio New Zealand. And we have got Lisa Owen with us, presenter of Checkpoint in Auckland, my home country of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Lisa, tell us, how did you devise your approach to covering this unprecedented lockdown as it was announced?
Well, we got a heads up that our Prime Minister was going to make an announcement. We got a really short period of warning, and she was going to make this announcement in her office. And it's the first time in our lifetimes a Prime Minister has ever done that. So we knew it basically wasn't going to be good. And our strategy was to roll with it, react as it happened, and, well, have our audiences back, because we knew that they were going to need information and fast.
Lisa, I said it before, and I've said it goodness knows how many times on air over the last 18 months. This was an unprecedented situation. Talk us through the reaction of the RNZ audience to your coverage.
I think the audience was shocked. Everybody was. I mean, we've never experienced anything like this at all, really, ever. And we get instant feedback via text and emails. We brought in a microbiologist who answered people's questions in real time. So they were reacting to the audience and giving them all the information that they needed. They were hungry for those details. And we also had someone on our program who had COVID, and they, well, choked and coughed and hacked through the entire interview and really gave people a raw insight to what we were dealing with, and it brought it home.
We have 4 nominees for the title of News Agency of the Year. The first finalist is AFP.
These are Rohingya refugees, half-starved, beaten and trying to leave Bangladesh.
Our second nominee is Agencia F. The next finalist is Feature Story News.
Shinzo Abe today saying that he's going to be stepping down due to his chronic health issues.
Here in this densely populated district of the Kowloon Peninsula of Hong Kong, there are many police cordons like the one that you can see behind me.
Remember, in February, we started to see investors get spooked then because they were worried that some of this asset purchasing and some of the stimulus money would be pulled back quite quickly.
Robin, unfortunately, it has just hit half-time, so you can hear a bit of the atmosphere behind us of 67,000 people crammed into Pushkash Stadium.
Our final contender is Ruptley.
No doubt about it. Agencies are the lifeblood of broadcast and digital news. None of us can do our work without them. So it is great to see 4 agencies competing for the title of News Agency of the Year. The judges agreed that for outstanding range and depth of coverage, for being daring and being on every front line, the winner in 2021 is AFP. And Juliette Ollier-Larousse is the director of AFP TV, joining us from Paris. And Juliette, what do you think it is that sets AFP apart?
Well, I would say what makes us really unique and different is our incredible network of nearly 2,000 journalists of 100 different nationalities. And it really showed, for example, after the coup in Myanmar, we were live not only for Yangon, but also from different cities in the country. We were also the first independent media to enter Tigray after the government offensive. And thanks to our incredible network in Afghanistan, we could cover the Taliban taking power all around the country and not only in the capital. Another difference is our deep multimedia culture. In our bureaus, text, photo and video reporters work hand in hand, and it has a huge benefit for the overall quality of our coverage.
Our news industry, Juliette, it is vibrant, it is constantly adapting. What are the changes you're noticing in the needs of your customers and clients?
Well, on the ground, verified and real-time coverage is what really clients expect from us firstly, and that remains a top priority for us. But the change is that now they are facing a huge challenge. They need to address the audience through their digital platforms. And it is crucial for all media to see how to keep the connection with a younger audience that no longer go to the legacy media. So for that, we focus on in-depth human stories, ordinary people like this couple separated by COVID, and subjects that matter to the new generations. Climate change, of course, but also social issues, diversity, gender, and obviously covering the digital world is also a very important subject for us, and fact-checking that we've seen it is so vital during the COVID pandemics.
It is estimated that over 25 million people are affected by autism. It's not widely understood, particularly in low and middle-income countries. Doordarshan looked at the research into this malfunctioning of the brain and its effects on families.
There are two tools that are extremely useful. One is structure and the other are visual supports. Structure means anything that has clarity. There is structure of space. This place is for keeping bags, this place is for keeping books, this place is for sitting and studying, this place is for free time, playing time, this trampoline is for jumping, this mattress is for jumping, but this bed is for sleeping.
Hate crimes against Asian Americans are escalating because of rhetoric spread during the pandemic. Phoenix Satellite Television reported on these shocking crimes.
83岁的越南裔老翁和75岁的华裔老妇谢肖珍，在旧金山市中心被无故殴打。
Asian American women and elders were being targeted, often for cultural reasons. They're reluctant to speak out, to press charges.
92% of the population of Asia and the Pacific, some 4 billion people, are exposed to levels of air pollution that pose a significant risk to their health. DW investigated the problem and explored possible solutions.
Vegetasi yang mengcover dari seluruh fasad bangunan ini dan juga yang pastinya bisa mereduksi iklim makro di sekitar bangunan ini, dan bahkan di dalam bangunan itu suhu ruangan itu bisa lebih rendah, at least -5 atau 1 derajat.
When schools closed in 2020, children had to study at home. In Romania, more than half of the country's pupils did not have a tablet or laptop or internet access. Worse still, in some villages, there's no power, forcing children to do their homework by candlelight, as Antenna 3 discovered.
Elena este doar unul din miile de copii ai României rurale care au aflat că școala se mută pe internet. Doar că internetul pentru ei e ceva la care încă visează.
Cum e în perioada asta?
Păi este foarte greu, mai ales că profesorii ne dau teme pe internet, iar eu, cum nu am nimic, mi este foarte greu.
Nu ai nimic? Ce înseamnă? Nu ai nimic?
Adică nu am nici curent electric, nu am nici telefon performant, cum au alții sau altele.
Te-a căutat cineva de pe la asistență socială să te întrebe? Și cum crezi că o să recuperezi tot ce se pierde?
Nu știu, chiar nu știu.
18 years old Sebastian Roman Galleguglio lives on the outskirts of Buenos Aires. As the pandemic hit, Sebastian was in training for the Deaf Olympics. Lockdown meant he couldn't get to his swimming pool, so his parents built one in just a few days. Info Bay told the story.
Zunga se metió, estaba a pelo nadando y se tiró con la gana que tenía de nadar. Metí el dedo al agua, me pasó el frío por todo el cuerpo. Me dijo, papi, ¿tenés frío? No, no tengo frío. Está linda. Me despierta a las 5 de la mañana y me dice, ya sé cómo la vamos a calentar. Hay una serpentina que se le pone adentro un tacho de 200 litros. Bueno, dale, mañana lo hacemos, le digo. Se calienta el agua, se le vuelca 1 hora antes de que él nade y Sebastián empieza a entrenar.
Dr. Scott Steiber has Lou Gehrig's disease. There's no cure and life expectancy is limited. But Scott, a trained anesthesiologist, likes thinking outside the box. He embraced prana, the energy body. The Duncan Entertainment Group followed Scott on a day and night in Miami.
When I started my yoga, I started to own my disability. I know what breath is now.
Inhale, reach out through the hands, bring forward, hold with nice stiff shoulders.
He was like, I don't understand why, but I feel like I'm being led from within. And so we started talking about prana.
We are resourceful and resilient humans, aren't we? Now, a commendation from our judges in the short documentary category for outstanding reporting with a compelling and poignant mix. It is Offline by the Candle from Antenna 3 in Romania. The winner for an ambitious and stylish production that leaves a deep and lasting impression on the viewer is Open Your Eyes to the Unseen, Mommy, I Can't Breathe, broadcast by Deutsche Welle. And Ben Fajzulan is an anchor, producer and reporter at DW joining us. And Ben, tell us about how you went about finding those affected by the issues you covered and those developing the solutions.
Well, first of all, we went to hospitals, we talked to doctors, pediatricians, lung specialists, and ended up, after quite a long time, finding a kid who was only 4 years old who had asthma and was in danger of worsening the situation for himself if he went out to play. He had to stay inside most of the day, he had to go to the hospital a lot to get checkups and always wear a mask, which is nothing new during these COVID times. But for him as a little kid, it was quite a struggle. And it was really interesting to hear from these doctors that the fine particulate matter from pollution that enters these kids' lungs gets into the bloodstream, goes to the brain, to the rest of the organs, and can stunt their growth. It was quite a grim picture.
And tell us, Ben, what's next for the series on Deutsche Welle?
Well, next up at DW, we're working on a series, 7 parts for the Indian market, for social media, and they're films about dreams and the choices we make in life. And it's very, very interesting. We have episodes on body positivity, on a 22-year-old boy who wants to become a male professional ballet dancer, and of course all of the challenges that they have trying to deal with these topics. Again, a very colorful series.
Voice of America deployed 75 news teams in 32 countries to chart how forced displacement affects people rich and poor, those taking flight and those out to stop them. A day in the life of refugees.
Turkey hosts more refugees than any other country. Here he has found both a home and success. He arrived in 2011. This day, he's a phenomenon. owner of Syrian restaurants now franchised across the country, a role model for Syrians and an example of a refugee who has done well.
Binlerce var iş adam, binlerce. Çok güzel şeyler. Fırın imalat var, yemek olarak tezgahlar var, makineler yapıyoruz, mermer, afyon.
In the first wave of the pandemic, Italy's Carabinieri ran emergency hotlines that fielded desperate phone calls from distressed and worried people. Italian film producer Max volunteered to help man the phones. Italy's COVID hotline.
I negozi sono chiusi, cioè veramente la situazione paradossale, cioè come fa, insomma.
E lei mi sta chiedendo una previsione a 6 mesi. Non la sappiamo a 14 giorni e non la sa il governo, neanche la salute, e di conseguenza io a 6 mesi non ci arrivo. Si è visto lì proprio in centrale operativa una discesa di questo virus. C'è stata proprio una preoccupazione.
1 in 5 Australians will have a problem with alcohol, drugs, or gambling at some point in their lives. For 6 months, the Addicted Australia team were given extraordinary access to 10 Australians and their families as they battled addiction.
Everyone's going to have that different point of realisation. Like, you've always got a new low. But when you've had enough, just tell everyone. Scream on the top of your fucking lungs in the middle of Spencer Street. Whatever you need to do. Anything that you feel like you can get it off your chest, do it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eve. Yes. Alright, happy birthday. The biggest difference is the relationship I have with my 2 kids. I don't give a fuck about anything else anymore. Like, that's it. That's what I've got back. I've got family. I've got something to look forward to.
One of the most contentious aspects of modern policing in the UK is stop and search. Black men are 9 times more likely to be stopped. 40 black men and teenagers told their stories in The Truth About Police Stop and Search.
The one thing that stuck with all of us is the red dots just like lining up and down on his back, like head to back, like picking a target.
It's mad. I'm gonna get up because my knee's killing me. Oh.
I was literally shaking afterwards. I mean, I couldn't imagine how my friends felt because they were really just the victims of the situation. I was more of a bystander, I felt.
This was miles off my radar in terms of what's going on. I'm disgusted. I really am. Never in a million years did I expect to see a 16-year-old on his knees with guns pointed at his head and a taser literally pressed against his neck.
In Australia, the trial of vosoritide, an experimental drug that aims to help children affected by dwarfism, is underway. However, many short-statured people fear the drug will destroy their community. Born Small investigated both sides of the argument.
Statistically, 80% of kids with dwarfism are born to average height parents, meaning the decision to put children into the vosoritide trial is often made by parents with little to no prior experience of dwarfism. This disconnect has led many to question the ethics of the vosoritide trial. Some in the short-statured community are going so far as accusing scientists of trying to eradicate little people.
Did you realise early on that the trial was controversial amongst the little people community?
Not at the beginning,
Okay.
but yeah, we've been a part of it for a while now and I'm aware of the controversy surrounding it.
At the height of the pandemic, more than 3.9 billion people were locked down. That's half the world's population. All hail the lockdown brought together diverse voices from around the world to look at the ties that bind us together.
Throughout human history, we have needed to rely on others for our survival, whether that's protection or efficiency in obtaining resources. Our brains have adapted to expect others. So when we lack the proximity to others, particularly trusted others, this in essence puts us on a state of alert because now we have to manage the threats in our environment on our own.
The latest science on loneliness shows that acute isolation has physical health repercussions too.
such as an increase in heart rate and blood pressure, a surge in stress hormones, and internal inflammation.
UK celebrity Davina McCall reached the age of 44 and thought she was losing it. Like many women, she hit her hot flushes, depression, mental fog and confusion caused by perimenopause.
Hormone replacement therapy is the NHS recommended first line of treatment for menopause.
There are different types, there are different doses. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
And I've got a confession to make.
I am on it. And 2 years ago, it's quite funny because I wouldn't have told you that, for starters, and I lied to my friends. I told them that I wasn't on it when I was on it.
But why is there such a stigma around HRT? To find out the reason for the negativity, we have to go back 2 decades.
7 strong contenders there for this Human Interest Award. Now, for an eye-opening production with immense depth, Dateline, Born Small from SBS Australia, is commended. The winner of the Human Interest TV Award, which judges said at long last delivered a decent documentary on this topic that combines thorough research with a human touch, is Davina McCall, Sex, Myths and the Menopause by Fine Stripe Productions for the UK's Channel 4. Now, Linda Sands is the producer and director of the programme. And Linda, how did your collaboration with Davina on such a personal issue come about?
This film was quite difficult subject matter. We wanted to appeal to a wide audience, so we wanted somebody who was quite well known, would have an emotional connection with our contributors, and we'd be able to carry this film and give it real heart. We had some contributors telling awful stories for the first time, and I think it was really important to find a presenter who would not only empathise with them, but embolden them. And when we approached Davina, it was like she'd been waiting for the call. She'd been very vocal about her own menopause, and she was ready to go to that place.
And tell us, Linda, what has been the reaction from the audience and indeed from the UK's medical practitioners to this programme?
The reaction's been overwhelming. I mean, I think it reaffirms my faith in the power of television. We saw immediately on social media all these women sharing awful stories about being on antidepressants when they really needed HRT and they went back to their doctor for a second opinion. We knew after a week that 2.2 million women in the UK, well, not just women, had watched it, which is amazing. 15,000 GPs signed up for menopause training. And in terms of the Channel 4, they have already commissioned a sequel because I think we both know that there's a lot more to say.
Marlo is a single mother raising her daughter, a daughter she once thought was her son. Our story, How to Be a Girl, is Marlo's search for families like hers.
It's not life when the people that you love don't love you back, don't accept or understand you, you know?
No, but really, T, I must say that this is our job. Loving our children is the greatest privilege that we've ever had. And loving our transgender children, oh wow, we hit the jackpot.
Absolutely, we're so lucky.
Isn't there a song, We're the Lucky Ones? Maybe, I don't know.
It should be a soundtrack to this,
Yeah.
eh?
We're the lucky ones.
Following the death by starvation of North Korean defector Han Swang-ok and her son, To Fly Again uncovers how defectors are treated and what's done to support them in their new life in the South.
저보다는 신랑이 먼저 느껴요. 그러니까 신랑이 제일 힘들어했던 게 저를 처음에 만났을 때 자다가 구석에 가 있는데요. 나는 모르고 기억이 안 나요. 전 자다가 한 행동이 기억이 안 나요.
같이 자다가
분명 같이 자는데 나도 자고 있은 것 같은데
몽유병처럼 일어나서
저 구석에 가서 이렇게 하고 막 이렇게 떨고 있고 자다가도 막 잘못했어 하면 그러면서 막 헛소리치고 막 몸부림을 치고.
Rais Bu-yan traded a job in the Bangladesh Air Force for a life in the US. 10 days after the 9/11 attacks, a man walked into the petrol station where Rais was working. He asked where he was from. Then the man shot him. The right thing, saving the man who shot me.
As news of the campaign that Reis was leading reached him on death row, Mark Stroman was overwhelmed, and he wanted to say so publicly. He wrote this in his blog from prison, voiced for us here by an actor.
There is a man out there that has every right to hate me for what I did after the 9/11/01 events that rocked our world. This man, Reis, has come to the forefront in an effort to show the world how forgiveness and compassion overrule the human nature of hate. He is an example that the human race should follow. Reis, I'm deeply touched by all you have said, and that's from my heart and soul.
In August 2020, the UK's Magic Radio ran The F Word, a week-long campaign exploring the generally taboo topic of fertility.
I'm Becky, I'm 33 years old and I live in Nottinghamshire. When I was going through IVF, working was one of the big challenges. Daily life would involve injections, which had to be taken at a particular time. Then later on in the cycle, having to go 3 times a day to the toilets to insert pessaries, which is quite invasive. Emotionally, having to go into a meeting straight after having bad news where you've been told that this chance has failed is a huge thing. For a time, I considered actually leaving and having a career break because I just couldn't handle the stress.
Conversations on coronavirus, remembering those lost to COVID-19, created an oral history of the pandemic through very personal stories contributed by listeners around the world.
Hello there, my name is Linda Carvery and I live in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada. I lost my 37-year-old son, Derek, to the coronavirus on May the 3rd. Derek had cerebral palsy and he loved music and he would loudly hum along to gospel songs he heard in church. He especially loved the songs by pop singer Michael Jackson, and Derek's dad, Nelson, made sure that he was listening to Heal the World just before he passed away.
There's a place in your heart, and I know that it is love.
In 1963, Irish photographer Eamon Kennedy photographed a young girl crying in Dallas just after JFK was assassinated. Documentary on One, The Grief of a Nation, told the story of how, many decades later, the photograph came into focus again.
To describe the picture here, and that's grief, and much of it. It's official. As of just a few moments ago, the President of the United States is dead.
Eamon's photographs outside Parkland capture this pandemonium. 2 African-American girls weeping, a father cradling his children, a state senator grimacing.
It was total chaos. A situation like that, you try and capture the essence of it and the mood of what was going on.
A priest walked out.
Kathy Atkinson.
And I'm sorry, I'm getting teary-eyed. A priest walked out and he said...
James Hodgkinson was killed by a single punch. Teenager Jacob Dunn was convicted of manslaughter. After Jacob's release, James's parents got to know him as part of the process of restorative justice. The punch.
I was sentenced to 30 months in custody, so 2.5 years. After hearing that sentence, what did you both think?
I felt James's life was worth more than what you served, and I also felt that it wasn't a deterrent for other people that were in your position when you done it. But what deterrent is that? If I kill somebody, that's what I'm going to get. Obviously, afterwards, things are different. I look at the sentence as different now.
Powerful radio and audio programs getting to the heart of often difficult and challenging stories. 2 commendations from our judges here. Firstly, for a totally engrossing, bold and original production, it is The Punch by Just Radio for BBC Radio 4, and for impressive use of original and archived sound to deliver a highly interesting, coherent narrative, The Grief of a Nation by Ireland's RTE. But for creating a must-hear programme that was simultaneously shocking and smooth, the winner of this Human Interest Award is OS Conversations, Remembering Those Lost to COVID-19, from BBC World with Boffin Media. We've got Luke Hastings, a broadcast journalist at BBC World Service, joining us from London today. And Luke, this was a unique venture as far as participation goes. Give us an idea of the numbers who actually wanted to share their messages via the program and why they wanted to do it publicly.
Well, dozens of people from 27 countries around the world sent us their audio messages. And the feeling I got from speaking to them was that people felt they couldn't say goodbye in the same way that they could, as in pre-pandemic times. They couldn't go to the hospital to see their loved one. They couldn't gather at funerals in the same way. So this was an opportunity for people to send in an audio message and tell us about their loved one and to pay tribute to them. And we hear every day on the news, we hear how many people have died, and what we don't hear is who these people were and what they love to do. So this was an opportunity for their loved ones to send us an audio message and tell the world about who they were.
Luke, thank you for that. We've also got BBC World Service presenter Nuala McGovern with us. Nuala, what has been the impact of this programme on your audience?
The impact, I think, has been immense. I have never had the response from our audience as I have during the pandemic. I think people looking to reach out and to have less of a sense of isolation with these huge life experiences that they were going through. One person wrote to me saying, "Your show has helped me," and I'm sure others find a sort of anchor and comfort amidst the chaos of this year. And people were sharing things that were so heartfelt, as in with this programme, coming together, sharing their grief, sharing their loss, but also finding one another and kind of beginning to understand exactly what this pandemic meant.
The murder of George Floyd set in train a social revolution, fighting once again for the equal rights of Black Americans. The turbulent revolution of George Floyd.
Overal werden de namen van zwarte slachtoffers gescandeerd. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd en Eric Garner. Op zaterdag 30 mei betoogden New Yorkers voor zwarte levens en zwarte burgerrechten. Op Staten Island ging ik naar de plek waar Eric Garner in 2014 werd gestikt door de politie. Zijn misdaad? Hij verkocht illegaal sigaretten op straat. Een agent hield hem toen in bedwang met een wurggreep, terwijl Garner tot aan zijn dood bijna fluisterde: "I can't breathe, I can't breathe."
Nations United, Urgent Solutions for Urgent Times, marked the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, telling the story of the world as it was, as it is, and as it could be.
Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rupture. But the rupture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine the world anew. This one is no different.
A grainy video of gunmen pushing two women, one with a baby on her back, the other hand in hand with a young girl. They are forced to kneel. Men with machine guns unleash a hail of bullets. Open source investigators try to uncover where and why it happened. The Bellingcat podcast.
If it had just been those two AKs, it would have been a dead end. But there's also a third rifle. This one isn't an AK or an AK copy, the kind of gun you could just pick up for a few $100s anywhere on the continent. This one was far more distinctive.
In the very beginning, you see the buttstock of it.
The stock of the rifle, the shoulder end basically, had a distinctive triangle-shaped hole running through it. It was clearly designed that way to make the weapon lighter and easier to carry.
And so that's immediately what I started tracking on where does this come from.
Brian thought that the rifle might be an Israeli-made Galil rifle. He wasn't sure though, and if the details aren't bang on perfect, you just don't have a match.
The Trans-Amazonian Highway stretches 4,260 kilometers, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It has been mired in controversy over deforestation, slavery, and other criminal activity. Sounds of the Transamazônica.
O fogo. O farfalhar de fagulhas, infeccioso, feito uma doença. De janeiro a outubro, foram mais de 93 mil focos de calor na Amazônia, de acordo com o INPE. Queimadas que produzem um som inconfundível. Famigerado. Mas que não fica só nos grandes incêndios. A fumaça dos fornos.
In March 2021, Islamist militants attacked Palma in northern Mozambique, center of a $20 billion gas project. They besieged a hotel where 200 civilians were taking shelter. Help would soon be on its way, wouldn't it? Left to die.
And just remember, ba 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 ba, and that sound of the bullets hitting the car and hitting the steel is something else. I felt a bullet come underneath my foot. It hit the bottom of the car, and I could feel where it hit, and my foot came up from it. Checked, everybody's okay, but it was panic stations.
In December 2004, a tsunami led to over 200,000 deaths in Southeast Asia. In the midst of the devastation, a Sky News camera crew find an 8-year-old boy. Storycast 21, Miracle Boy.
He had been basically living on the beachfront. He had seen his family washed away. He'd obviously then been wrapped up in the wave and deposited somewhere. But he was trying to make his way back there to see if there was any survivors. He was sleeping in amongst bodies, finding floating packets of dried noodles, and that's what he would be eating for 20 days.
Now, this was an extremely closely fought category, and the judges asked for 2 commendations here. First, for an utterly gripping story and impressive level of detailed investigation, the Bellingcat podcast by Novel, and for compelling actuality and narrative with effective use of music, The Turbulent Revolution of George Floyd by VRT News Belgium. The winner, though, of the Factual Podcast Award this year goes to a program the judges said was an effective realization of a great original idea that had superb production values, making it powerful and poignant. It is Nations United, Urgent Solutions for Urgent Times by TBI Media and 72 Films. Now, Jeff Jane is head of audio at TBI Media in London. And Jeff, what were the challenges of working in a format in English and other languages?
Well, actually, with this project, the objectives were really clear from the start. We knew that's what we were creating. So this had to work as a script, which isn't dissimilar to delivering an international version of a TV programme. We stripped out the voiceover line, provided a script that could be translated into any language and work with the rest of the documentary. So a lot of the hard work would be done by other production teams around the world. But for us, we always knew this was a project about getting as many people to listen to it, whether it was a soundbite in a news from the programme, or whether it was one of the cut down kit parts we created, or as a reversioning for another language.
Jeff, the programme was syndicated. Tell us about the take-up by broadcasters around the world.
So I've had to do some digging to get the answer to this question, actually. As the programme maker, we handed over the programme back to Project Everyone at the United Nations, who then did the distribution for it. But they've given me a list of the countries that this went to. It includes Cyprus, Serbia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, Mali, Japan, Russia, Cameroon, Lebanon, Indonesia, Nigeria, New Zealand, to the African Union of Broadcasters across Africa, and to the Asia Pacific Broadcasting Union across Asia Pacific. So it's the first time I've actually seen that list of countries that the programme went to, and it's an extraordinary thing, and we're incredibly proud.
For the year before the fall to the Taliban, a new and sinister campaign of violence against young professionals, particularly women, was spreading across Afghanistan. All the victims were working to build a country based on democratic values. Killing hope.
Natasha got a job with the Afghanistan Human Rights Commission.
و بسیار دختر پرتلاش بود و بسیار رویاهای کلان داشتن برای افغانستان و هم برای خودش. و دختر بسیار نترس و شجاع بود و رقمی که میخواست.
She was the youngest, so we were the least worried about her. This was her first job. She did not have this big public image of working either with the US government or Afghan government or any other international organization.
In Deciphering Japan, journalist Yumi Araki returns to the country of her birth to get at the heart of what it means to be Japanese today, hanging out with bartending Buddhist monks and psychedelic pop artists.
On the surface, this place, with its bubblegum pop aesthetic, seems light years away from the sullen stone statues you encounter at Japanese shrines. But Sebastian is right. There is something monstrous to it all that feels oddly familiar. I wonder what lies behind this unique aesthetic.
やっぱり可愛いっていうのは表面的なものだけじゃなくて、その奥に秘めているやっぱこう内包しているちょっとある意味毒々しいところとか、可愛いとは相反する部分が結構重要だと思ってるんですよ。
6 million foreign workers live in Malaysia. When lockdown happened, the government quarantined the poorest areas of Kuala Lumpur, putting large migrant populations behind barbed wire. Locked up in Malaysia's lockdown.
The Bangladeshi migrant shows me footage of what happened here after the area was locked down behind razor wire. Raihan says when he heard a knock on his apartment door, he thought it was government workers coming to test for COVID-19 or deliver aid. Instead, over the next few days, almost 600 residents were rounded up, put in trucks and taken away.
They make a trap for us. They give food, they give medication, all things they give. So no one expecting they were going to arrest the people. They are not murderer, they are not criminal. They are just undocumented.
As the vaccine rollout continued apace in Wales, a significant number of people refused to be jabbed. Misinformation about the vaccine is behind this hesitancy, both in Wales and in America, as COVID e-jab NU discovers.
Everyone getting it is helping the virus become deadly.
Report: Georgia mother of 2 dead after receiving COVID vaccine.
Mae llawer o'r fideos ma'n cael eu tynnu lawr, ond beth sy'n fy syni I ydy ffeindio bod y cwmnïau cyfryngol mawr ma'n gwneud $1 biliwn o ddoleri flwyddyn o gynnwys y diwydiant anti-vax drwy hysbysebion yn bennaf. Mae'n hen bryd cael atebion.
I will not never going to take the vaccine. Why do I want somebody to push something onto me and not?
I'm perfectly healthy and fine. We're not going to die from it. And you know what? If we do, then it was our time to go because we believe in God.
Whether you are 9 or 49, if you're a black man in Britain, there's a strong chance that the police will stop and search you. The truth about police stop and search.
My youngest memory of the police is my dad getting pulled over with me and my sister in the car. He's trying to make things like this not happen to all these people, and then it's happening to me and him right now. That was the thing that upset me.
Yeah, it's crazy. When you have Cressida Dick, the commissioner, saying that institutional racism and that term is unhelpful language, when you have Sir Stephen House, the deputy of the Met, saying we're going to carry on doing disproportionate stop and search, when you've got that kind of leadership, policing is in a bit of a mess.
New Zealand Wars, Stories of Tai Nu, looks at the events leading to the invasion of the Waikato and its consequences that still resonate today.
Governor Gray attempted to justify the unjustifiable, really, through assembling a dodgy dossier of evidence that supposedly incriminated Tainui, but in fact did no such thing.
Dawn, July 12, 1863, and Tainui's worst fears unfold. Hundreds of Imperial troops cross the Mangatawhiri River. This is the dividing line, the frontier between colonial Auckland and the sovereign Māori lands of Waikato.
It was a summer evening in Sydney, and 7 children were walking along the pavement to get ice cream. A drunk and drugged driver lost control of his car, mounted the pavement, killing 4 of the children who were all related. united in tears, the Oatlands tragedy.
It helps with the grieving when you're standing together and you're praying and you're all in close proximity, and just you can feel the love, and you know you're sad and you cry, but you're together and you're just working through the motions together.
The cohesion in the community was enormous. Like, it was unbelievable. Just, we drive past the accident site every day. We got no choice that we have to drive past there every day. And the community, there's always people at the site, people reflecting on the site. It made people closer, you know, made people a bit more aware of what can happen.
7 highly varied and at times heartbreaking productions there. The judges praised the quality of all the finalists in Domestic Affairs documentary and asked that 2 be marked out for particular commendation. First, for an informative documentary where the presenter becomes part of the story. It is Deciphering Japan by Peddling Pictures for CNA Media Corp. And for a great fusion of history and the present day, New Zealand Wars, Stories of Tainui, produced by Great Southern Pictures for Radio New Zealand. The winner in this category, though, for an impactful, thought-provoking and sometimes visionary production is Killing Hope, Targeted Attacks in Afghanistan from BBC News Persian. And Zia Shahriya is a senior journalist at BBC Persia, who's with us now. Zia, how do you approach finding and verifying the stories of those people who had been attacked?
I gathered the names of more than 36 of journalists and civil activists targeted in Afghanistan following the US Taliban deal of February 2020. Looking at profession, gender and geography, we decided to include the stories of 6. We couldn't travel to Afghanistan because of security and COVID. So I used my phone, email, text, WhatsApp, even Zoom, all from my living room in London. I spent many hours building trust with contributors, and editorial transparency was absolutely crucial. Verifying facts involved piecing together reports, photos, scraps of information. The attacks were unclaimed, and while there were strong indications of Taliban and IS involvement, we had to be careful with the issue of responsibility.
Yeah, and now that Afghanistan has fallen to the Taliban, do you know what's happened to those featured in your program?
I talked to the family members of all victims whose stories we told in the documentary. Natasha's family have made it to the US through the Kabul airport chaos and are at a refugee camp in Virginia. Malala's family are still living in Jalalabad, still fearing IS threats and attacks. Ilyas Dai's relatives are still living in Lashkargah, fearing threats from the Taliban and his alleged killers. Yusuf Rashid's father died 3 months ago, and his brother and other members of family are still living in Kabul in hiding, facing threats from his alleged killers, also released from prison. Anissa Shahid has also been evacuated to US, and Farahnaz Protan is still in US working for her active job.
Zia Shahriya, thank you for that. Now, in a few moments, we will return to Simon Spanswick in Hastings, who'll be in conversation with a documentary photographer, writer and chef. I won't spoil the surprise on that. But first, we come to the AIB Media Freedom Award. The Association for International Broadcasting is committed to promoting media freedom, and part of its work is to inspire organisations to devote more resources to covering media freedom issues and to encourage and promote the initiatives that protect journalists and journalism around the world. This year, the AIB has launched its Media Freedom Award. This recognises and rewards the broadcaster, TV, radio or digital, that has actively covered, promoted or protected media freedom, and 4 organisations have been considered for this inaugural award. They are ABS-CBN News in the Philippines, Radio Free Asia, Global Mandarin, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and Voice of America. Now, the judges looked at the very different ways these 4 organisations approached media freedom, considering impact, resources, audience reaction, and plenty more. The jury came to the decision that the winner for its clear and long-term commitment to the promotion of media freedom is Voice of America. And joining us from Washington, D.C., our press freedom editor, Jessica Jarrett, and executive producer, Beth Mendelsohn. Congratulations to both of you. Jessica, first of all, what's the importance of monitoring and promoting media freedom to VOA?
The importance of a free press is not lost on VOA. Our journalists report from some of the most censored regions in the world, and they really understand the impact that unbiased and independent news can have on our audiences. But in recent years, we've seen an increase in attempts to silence or discredit the media. Those efforts ramped up in 2020 as governments sought to silence reporting on the global pandemic, and journalists were increasingly targeted while covering protests or elections. We even came under pressure within our own newsroom when there were efforts to breach a firewall that protects us from political interference. But by reporting on these stories, by shining a light on these attempts to discredit or stop reporting, we were able to show our audiences the important role that journalists play.
And Beth, what do you think broadcasters can do to ensure their audiences understand the importance of media freedom? Because we as journalists, we know it.
Documentary filmmaking has brought a heightened awareness to the issue of press freedom. In the documentary, Turkey Breaking the Silence, we systematically look at the erosion of press freedom in Turkey under the leadership of President Erdogan. Broadcasters have a responsibility to tell the truth about tyranny around the world, and the responsibility to be certain that it's not just one journalist, and it's not just two journalists, it's the responsibility of media itself for audiences to get a clear picture of what's happening around the world. And that their voices, the voices of journalists, under no circumstances should be silenced.
Beth Mendelsohn and Jessica Jarrett there in Washington, D.C. Media freedom is critically important to everyone. All of us working in this industry should make sure we protect the ideals of media freedom and ensure that our audience understands that if it goes, their lives will be negatively impacted. Now let's get back to Hastings in the UK and Simon Spanswick.
Thanks, Kamahl. Now, I said at the start of the programme that there was another reason for us being in Hastings besides the John Logie Baird connection. That's because Hastings is where documentary photographer, writer and chef Giles Dooley lives. Giles has kindly invited us into his home on the seafront to tell us what's happened in his life since he was last at the AIBs back in 2013. Giles, thank you for having us.
No, pleasure to reconnect. I was just thinking what's happened. I think I've got a lot greyer actually since I last saw you.
You and me both, I think, yes. Now, you've undertaken a huge amount of work over the past 8 years. You've expanded on and developed your interests, but have kept at the heart of your work telling stories about the impact of conflict and war on civilians. One of those initiatives took place with the UNHCR and the band Massive Attack. Tell us how that came about.
In 2015-16, I was commissioned by the UNHCR to document the refugee crisis across the Middle East and Europe. They gave me probably, this will make everybody jealous, probably the greatest assignment ever given to a filmmaker, photographer or journalist. Normally you get pages and pages of notes and requirements. They sent me an email with one sentence which said, follow your heart. And that was my project for a year, which was a dream assignment. But I really wanted to get those stories out into a wider audience. And I had a relationship, I started out as a rock and roll photographer. I lived in Bristol in my late teens at the time when the band Massive Attack had their first album, Blue Lions, come out. It was kind of the soundtrack to my youth. Funny enough, when we were 18, I'd met Rob Danelja from Massive Attack and he'd said, come and show me your work. And I said, well, it's not ready yet. So it turned out it was 20-something years later on the shores of Lesbos. I called him and I said, I'm ready now. We need to work together on something. And then that came to a climax when they were doing a homecoming gig in Bristol. And we used a series of portraits along with their famous track, Unfinished Sympathy. And for me, it was actually one of the most moving moments of my life as a storyteller. And seeing 30, 40,000 people cheering as these images, these portraits of refugees in Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan came up was incredibly moving. I hate the expression to give people voice. We don't give people voice. Our job is to make sure their voices are amplified in the purest form we can.
Last year, soon after the pandemic hit, you spent time documenting the response to COVID-19 at 3 London hospitals, and you wrote an article for the British GQ magazine on what you found and the sheer scale of the task facing medical staff all of a sudden. What did you think you would find, and what did you actually discover as the health service came under the most intense pressure?
I spent 46 days in intensive care after getting injured in Afghanistan, and it was actually some of those doctors were the ones that had asked me to go and document it. I had ARDS when I was injured, which is where your lungs fill with fluid, which is the same outcome of people when COVID attacks your immune system. So I saw myself as being increasingly vulnerable. Actually, all the doctors said, you can survive anything. You're more survivable than anybody we know. You'll be fine. But I think to have that empathy and understanding of what people were going through was very difficult. But this is where my experience suddenly turned things around, because I was around, as I say, doctors and nurses and other medical staff that I knew. But I also knew what it was like to be in intensive care. And I remember distinctly one moment, one of the doctors there, Dr. Qureshi, she's an anaesthetist, and she was talking to a patient who was unconscious and holding his hand, talking to him. And I started welling up in tears, and it was a reminder for me that these incredible staff of the NHS, they are so stressed at that point. I mean, they were beyond exhaustion. They were dying, you know, they were fearful, there were bits of PPE. I mean, I was wearing goggles from a ski mask. I mean, everybody was just doing what they could. But even in that crisis, they would always take the time, even when a patient was unconscious, to hold the hand, to have that moment of empathy, that moment of human contact, and talk to them and explain to them what was going. And I knew that's what had happened to me when I was in hospital, even when I was unconscious. And that is the remarkable nature of everybody that works for the NHS.
Tell us about the contrast, if you would, between what you found in London and what you found in other places on your travels.
I suppose the biggest contrast might be in DR Congo. I was in Goma. And actually, in some ways, they were very well prepared because of something like Ebola. They're used to having to have these conditions where, for example, you have checkpoints where you have to stop, get out your car, wash your hands, get in, have your temperature taken. You know, they're very aware of community diseases like that. At the same time, they couldn't do lockdown. It's simply not possible when people are living hand to mouth every day, when people are living as subsistence farmers. You cannot lock down and support people. So life really goes on as normal. It was actually often referred to as the white man's disease to me. You know, so I would turn up at the barbers, for example, and everybody left because they said, well, the white man's come with COVID. So it's very interesting to see a sort of complete flipped perspective on it. People there have accepted it as another disease alongside malaria, say alongside Ebola, things that they're dealing with, that you get sick, you go home, you lie down for a couple of weeks, you either die or you don't die. And one of the great examples for me of the global imbalance in healthcare was when I was in Congo. I think there were 2 to 3 ventilators in the country. Now, at the same time, the TV show Holby City here in the UK donated, because it turned out on their TV set, they had some working ventilators that they were donating to the NHS. And I remember being in Congo and thinking, how crazy is it that we live in such an imbalanced world that a TV show in London had more working ventilators than the whole of a country here in Africa.
Afghanistan's remained such an important part of your life for many reasons. You went back there in July this year, days before the country fell completely to the Taliban. What was your reason for going on this occasion?
I felt still we were not hearing enough about the civilian casualties. And I thought maybe it's my last opportunity to go back and to do that story. So in July I went back to the hospital run by the Italian NGO Emergency, who I have a very long relationship with. And the project was very simple. I wanted to tell the stories of injured civilians, but with this process I was already thinking this was not going to be necessarily a magazine article or a film. This was going to be to work with other artists, to create collaborations, to create visuals about the story there. So it was very specific as sort of what I was doing, this sort of series of portraits. And actually for the first time I shot moving image. But being the Luddite I am, I was shooting on an 8mm film camera, which was like my considering I still shoot on film on an old Hasselblad. So for me, this was a big step forward in technology, was to have a 1970s cine camera. But actually it was really powerful to shoot some black and white film of portraits and at some of the rehab centres. It was really moving. I think the most important thing for me was to go into these wards, interview young children, adults injured, and basically have exactly the same conversations I had 10 years before when I made the film Walking Wounded. And you just kind of suddenly hit by this thing that in that 10 years since, I'd gone off and done loads of other things, been traveling around the world doing other stories. But for the people of Afghanistan, nothing had changed in those 10 years. There was no stability. Nothing had changed. I have seen who is responsible for what is happening in these countries. And it's not enough for me just to document it and stay quiet. I have the same responsibility that I would have if I saw something outside my window. And so for me, yeah, I think as journalists, we have to also hold people accountable for what has happened in the last 20 years.
You founded the Legacy of War Foundation. What is its purpose?
I guess a theme really of this whole conversation is frustration from my side as a journalist and storyteller that I wasn't doing enough, or wasn't having enough impact. And that really was very symbolic in just after we met, and we did the interview in 2013. A couple of years later, I was fully kind of working back on track, and I was in Lebanon documenting some of Syria's most vulnerable refugees, the elderly single-parent families and those living with war injuries like myself. And one was an amazing woman called Khulud, who had been shot by a sniper in Syria. She was paralyzed from the neck down. She'd actually fallen on top of one of her own children. She was in the garden. Her family had managed to get her emergency medical treatment, and when I met her, they had escaped into Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, where she was living in a makeshift tent, a tent made of cardboard, plastic, posters ripped down from billboards. Now, if you imagine a woman who's tetraplegic living in a homemade tent with her husband Jamal as her carer, the children would have to sleep on the floor beside her bed. There was no windows in this tiny little room. And I did her portrait, and we chatted for the day, and I always remember her saying her one hope for the future was to be a mother again. Anyway, she left a really big impression on me, but there were many other stories I did on that project. Those photographs were published around the world. It was kind of when I felt I already got my life back as a photographer after my own injuries. 2 years later, I was back in Lebanon, and I tracked down a lot of the people that I had met 2 years before. And I got a phone call from Jamal, the husband of Khulud, this woman, and he rang and said, "We'd love to see you. We hear you're back in Lebanon." And I said, "Yeah, of course. Where are you?" And he said, "We're in the same place you last saw us." And I will always remember that conversation. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, because I said, "Well, no, but where are you now?" And he said, "That same tent." And to be honest, I hadn't even bothered to go and look for them there. I just assumed, a tetraplegic woman living in a homemade tent that was like an oven in the summer. It was like a freezer in the winter. These pictures have been published. They've been used by NGOs. I thought I'd done my job, sort of certain naive arrogance that came with thinking if my pictures had been published, then something would have changed for this family. And to hear nothing had, I felt like, well, what's the point of doing what I do? I went to see them the next day. I walked into that tent. Khulud had not moved from that bed in 2 years. And I burst into tears and I said, "I failed you." And Khulud is like an angel. She just smiled. She said, "It's okay, we knew you'd come back." But in my heart, I knew that I could no longer do this. I could no longer go and tell people stories and walk away from them and nothing changed for them. And I said, "Well, look, can I spend the week here and document everything?" And I spent my whole time documenting every moment of their life. Jamal is so sweet. There's this tiny, it's like a little kitchen on the side. It's like a corner room. And he cooks there, and he'll whisper to me his greatest fear. And his greatest fear, this man that has lost his home, his career, that lives in a tent with his family, his greatest fear is that Khulud does not love him as much as he loves her. It's a house full of love. And I don't know, it's strange to explain, but you feel uplifted leaving there. It was a huge moment for me because, as I say, I realized it just was not enough for me to document. I had to make sure that these things created real change. So I teamed up with an actor called Misha Collins, a US actor who has a big following on social media. He's in a TV series that's very popular. And each year he kind of does a campaign to try and change a life. And we did it together. And we raised $250,000 in the space of 2 weeks through a crowdfunding campaign. And suddenly there was $250,000 to help not just Khulud's family, but many other families that I knew in Lebanon. And I decided that if I was going to do it properly, I needed to set up a charity, a foundation. And that's what we did. And the Legacy of War Foundation was created at that moment. And it's interesting that development from me now, that probably takes up as much as my life as photography and journalism does. It's grown. We have some wonderful projects. Land for Women is the project I guess I'm most proud of in Rwanda, where we set up cooperative farms, but we actually buy the land and give it to the women. So we change the power dynamic of how charities work, so they then choose to work with us.
What's your message to politicians, having seen over the last couple of decades the effects of conflict and war?
When I was in Afghanistan recently, and you're sitting there with injured civilians. The reality is, I know as a UK taxpayer, I was partly responsible for what was happening there. And it is for me to hold my politicians accountable for that. So what I'm trying to do now with my work is we're working with universities, we're working with younger people who are actually much more politically active than I think for many generations people have been. You look at what's happening with environmental issues and approaching conflict in the same way and saying, actually, I am not prepared for my tax dollars, my tax pounds to be used to create wars, to bomb other countries. I've spent a lot of time on different front lines, and I spent time at the front lines of the NHS. The NHS was screaming out for more funds for ventilators. I've never sat on a front line where a commander has said to me they really wanted to bomb somebody today, but they just don't have the weapons to do it. There's always the funding for that. And all I'm saying is that we need to relocate some of that funding into worthwhile projects.
Now, aside from photography, you've got another great passion, and that's food. You've uncovered a synchronicity almost between the aftermath of conflict and food. How did that come about?
I went into quite a dark patch. I actually wasn't even making photographs because I was struck by the reality that whatever photograph I took that day, nothing was going to change. It felt completely and utterly pointless. You're kind of there going, why am I even bothering? What arrogance have I got to even be here taking photographs? And it was actually one of the mothers of an injured child who said to me one day, why are you not taking photographs? And I explained to her, and she just looked at me, she said, when a child is injured like this, the whole world needs to see it. Do your job. And it was kind of wake-up call for me, but I did come back in a very dark place and was quite overwhelmed by things, and I was here at home, curtains shut, and I knew I needed to kind of kick myself out of this spiral I was in. And I started cooking because I'd always found cooking a way to relax. And this time it really did become my therapy, and I was cooking 24/7. I mean, my neighbours loved me because they were getting knocks on the door all around the clock with food left outside their doors. But it really was a moment when I realised that actually food is a therapy for me. And in the past I used to run before my injuries, and maybe some people find it in yoga. For me, I find peace in food. And so that's kind of where the love really came back. And then that slipped into my work because I realized that this was the best way to build relationships with the people I photograph. So I decided that I would never photograph people now if I hadn't eaten with them first. And I found this was a wonderful way to build relationships, was cooking with families.
Now, you've got an Instagram profile called The One-Armed Chef that documents the food you prepare in your kitchen here and around the world. And there's a synchronicity here as well, perhaps, between a photography platform and your passion for food. Although I think there's been some confusion at Instagram about who exactly you are.
Actually, it started because I would go to restaurants and my meal would come cut up, and they would have made a decision that my food should be cut up for me. And I used to stay quiet because I thought, well, they're trying to be helpful. But it used to ruin my food. I love presentation, I love the way things look, and basically, your food came out like it was prepared for a child. And it was actually very humiliating. You'd be on a date, and this is one of the problems of living with disability, is people make these assumptions in their mind. And my greatest disability is in the eyes of others. It's their assumptions. So I decided to challenge it rather than just get angry about it by showing some of the food that I could cook. And I started putting the Instagram together for The One-Armed Chef. And so if my food came cut up, I would say, take this back to your chef, because I think I can cook better than him. And I can do better than him with one-handed, so he better redo my meal. And it's sort of half-joking way then of challenging people's preconceptions. But that's how it started, and then it sort of took off from there. And yeah, it's funny because I get people now coming to The One-Armed Chef and asking me, have I ever thought about being a photographer, because my food pictures are really good. So it's kind of taken on its own life, but I love that. And as I say, food is in every part of my life. It's how I communicate with people, build relations. It's how I tell stories. I do supper clubs now and events around food. When I have exhibitions, I always cook at them now, so people can sit and eat and chat. And as I say, then it's also taken on its own thing. So I now do guest appearances in restaurants, and have just been doing a TV series for Vice in the States called The One-Armed Chef, which was me traveling to various areas, mainly conflict zones, again showing how food is how we find peace, sanctuary, and express love.
Giles Dooley, thank you so much for inviting us into your home here in Hastings and for all the work you're doing to continue to document the effect of conflict on civilians around the world.
What an extraordinary man Giles Dooley is, an absolute inspiration to all of us. Well, we are halfway through the packed AIBs 2021. Huge congratulations to all the winners so far. Still to come, we have Arts, Science, the Natural World Awards, plus the hard-hitting Investigative and International Affairs Documentary Awards. We'll also be announcing the winner of our Young Journalist and Channel of the Year Awards. So there is lots still to see in the second part of the AIBs 2021, which will be released on Monday, November 15th at 1500 hours GMT. I do hope you'll be able to join me then to see more of the world's best journalism and factual productions. Until then, on behalf of the Association for International Broadcasting and the team here in Doha, I'm Kamahl Santamaria, and we'll see you again soon.